Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
This month's Diggers and Dreamers podcast welcomes one of the original members of our own team, Jonathan Howe. Bookshops, wholefoods, publisher, co-op development, would-be filmmaker, Jonathan has had his fingers in many pies over the years. In this podcast, he recounts how urban squatting scene in Britain was very much a sister of the emerging communes movement. We follow the growth of the counterculture in the 1970s through to the birth of Diggers and Dreamers in the late 1980s. We get to consider the place of intentional communities in the greater scheme of social change, as well as the phenomenon of imaginal cells and the soup stage of human development. It was great to catch up with Jonathan, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Today, we are welcoming Jonathan Howe to the Diggers and Dreamers podcast. Jonathan is a well-recognised figure within the communities movement and was actually a founder member for Diggers and Dreamers right back in the dawn of time known as 1989, having been one of the editors for the very first communities directory, and also engaged in other publications such as Places to Be publication, which ran for a period of time alongside Diggers and Dreamers. So good morning, Jonathan. How are you?
Hello.
Hi. I thought we might start by asking you just to sort of give us some background into what brought you to that moment in time when Diggers and Dreamers was born. So could you let us know a little bit about where you've been before that and some of your history, please?
Yeah, well, I originally went to architecture school, and in that period in the early 1970s, had a lot to do with people who were squatting. I was a bit too timid to squat myself, actually, but I very much admired people who were doing it. And for people who, weren't around then, I mean, it's a revelation that there was so much property, particularly in the bigger cities in this country, that was empty, and people just squatted it and lived in it for free, basically. But I think the thing that really struck me about the squatting projects that I kind of observed was the creation of community within them, and often areas that were very run down. Suddenly, there was this sort of alternative culture that was created there, often in city centres, and I thought that was quite inspiring. And
Can you think of any examples of squats maybe that stood out for you? Because where were you in university?
in London, and it was Tolmer's Village, which was alongside Euston Station, which was the place that I was most familiar with. But there was squatting going on all over the place. But Tolmer's Village actually, I think people consciously set out to rebuild the community there at a sort of street by street level. And obviously there was a lot of house sharing going on. But it was that community building at the broader level that was more striking. But in parallel to that, clearly there were people setting up communes in the country a lot at that time. Lauriston Hall and places I can remember contemporaries of mine at the architecture school going on a visit to Lauriston Hall and coming back and telling us all about it. And that's another thing that I think people are, cannot quite believe now, that there are all these huge country houses in Britain. It's something that's a bit of a peculiarity to Britain, I think. They were just empty, or nobody really knew what to do with them. And they were being sold off very, very cheaply. And it seems an unbelievable thing now, but it was happening all the time in the
And
90s.
do you think there's a link? Because you said that you were at university doing an architecture course, but it does sound like the architecture movement was quite closely aligned to thinking about inhabiting spaces, buildings, community, those sorts of things.
Certainly, yeah, there was a proportion. There was a large proportion of the students who saw architecture as a very lucrative career for the future. But there were quite a lot of us who were interested in other ways of doing things. And, rumbling along in the background was what in this country got labeled the alternative society. But it was something, I suppose, in the broader sense, it was called the counterculture in North America in the 1960s, and it envisaged, different ways of living in many aspects of life, really. And so that was all like rumbling around in the background. And then at the same time, a lot of environmental stuff seemed to be coming to a head. There was a much, much greater awareness of pollution, and the famous Limits to Growth report came out in the early 1970s, saying that basically we couldn't go on living exponentially increasing lifestyles on a fixed sized planet,
It's
and how right they were.
incredible that that was the 1970s. We have known about this for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
I always think of Matt Groening, who created the Simpsons. He says the hippies were right all along. And they were. The trouble was they weren't that organized.
Oh dear. So do you think the 70s was a period of growth, or particularly stands out for the communities movement?
I think it was, because I think it was by that time there were people who, I don't know, had lived fairly exotic kind of lifestyles in their teens and early 20s, and were getting older and having children and things, and thought we need to do something more permanent. And a lot of 1970s communes came out of that period. So there was much more of that kind of thing really happening in the 1970s than in the 1960s, where it was just a fantasy.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think I can think of a whole raft of communities that sprung up around that time. And like you say, the big buildings, so the stately homes, and also perhaps things like what would have been nursing homes previously, sort of those big collective buildings. Yeah, thinking maybe, there's Thunder Cliff, isn't there, up by Sheffield, and as you say, Lauriston Hall.
So the other thing I think that led me in this direction was all these directories that existed at that time. Once again, they don't really exist much in a printed form now, because we have the World Wide Web. But
Mm.
before the World Wide Web, information got to people via books, magazines, and directories. And directories are a big thing, actually. And I think that was something that really did happen in the 1960s in many different fields of activity. Creation of kind of more organized directories of things. Magazines like Time Out in London suddenly organized cultural at the advertising or promotion of cultural events in a way that had never ever been done before. And in the world of sort of alternative lifestyles, there were, a number of magazines, and then there was this fabulous telephone directory-sized book called Alternative England and Wales, which Nicholas Saunders put together. And he spent a year traveling around Britain gathering information and produced this amazing directory. And in amongst it were the communes. And that was probably one of the first places where I became aware that there was actually quite a lot of these communities out there. And I think I myself, from the beginning, I thought I was always interested in like promoting things at, to a wider audience, really. And, I think what would be called the meta level now, that's the like the posh word for it. Um, So I kind of wanted to set up a radical bookshop. And so I discovered there was this thing called the Federation of Radical Booksellers, and I went along to their meetings, and then we set up a bookshop, a bunch of us running as a Whole Food as a workers' co-op, and we also
Mm.
sold Whole Foods. And so then we were involved in setting up the Federation of Southern Whole Food Co-ops, and we were like bringing together all these cooperatively run whole food shops in the south of England for regular meetings to share ideas and that sort of stuff.
That
So
is something that I have memory of actually, having come along to this scene a little later than yourself, Jonathan. But that there was definitely a link between whole food shops and that kind of crazy notice board, leaflets, booklets, various information that you probably wouldn't find in many other places.
mm,
And again, radical bookshops. It's a weird amalgamation, but they made sense, and they were the places that people would go.
yeah, very much so.
Carry
I
on.
was going to say when I actually joined a community myself,
Mm. Mm.
um, it was quite uh, I suppose quite a symbolic thing actually. The I went for a weekend as a prospective member, and during that very weekend, a bunch of people from different communities all around the country were getting together, uh, really to discuss the idea of promoting communal living to a wider audience. And primarily, they wanted to make a film about communal living.
Mm-hmm.
And there used to be this outfit called Concord Films that I think had grown out of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and they kind of produced films, and I think they organised film showings throughout the country. We had this idea that we would get Concord Films to make a film about communes, and so I actually joined that community, Redfield in North Berks, and so from day -1, practically, I was involved in promoting communal living because I spent my entire weekend as a prospective member there in this meeting
Oh my
about
God.
about bringing communal living to a wider audience.
So right in at the thick
Yeah.
end. Okay. And so how did that all go?
So we met up again and again and again and again, and about 18 months later, I think we realized we were never going to make a film. It wasn't going to happen. Uh, but we also still thought that there was a real need to bring communal living to a wider audience. And we felt that the way it was being done at the time, there was a magazine, it was a sort of loose organization that produced a magazine, and it was called Communes Network. And it had individuals and communities as its members. The editorship of the magazine rotated between communities. Sometimes a community would be very, very enthusiastic and produce really good editions. Other times, perhaps not so much. And so it was a bit of a spasmodic thing. And we thought, this is no good. If we're going to bring these ideas to a wider audience, we need to bring something, that has a bit of a presence to it and a bit of continuity. And I think we were still too, we couldn't imagine producing a book at the time.
Mm.
And so we came up with this thing called the Communes Network Information Pack. And we produced a number of sort of help sheets, about a dozen of them, I think, and we had them printed. At that time, Lifespan Community up in Yorkshire, that was an income sharing community at the time. I mean, it still exists to this day, but at the time it was uh, very much based around a printing business, and so they printed these information sheets, and we collated them together. And every pack contained a directory, which was just a little stapled booklet, and the latest edition of Communes Network magazine. I think we had maybe 500 of these things printed,
Hmm.
and yeah, it took us 5 years to sell them, basically.
Oh my God. I think I've seen an image of that. Did it come in like a little folder? So it was all
Yes,
in
a
a
green folder.
folder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Do I seem to remember reading somewhere that people would just nick the bit they wanted?
That's why bookshops hated selling them, because they'd lost their components.
So, yeah. So they kind of allowed for naughty behavior from the very beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
So, having created the Communes Network information pack, which took significantly longer to sell, I'm guessing than you had initially thought. What was the next stage for that?
Well, once they ran out, we thought,
Mm.
yeah, we've got to do a book. And by that time, Lifespan was its printing business was at a stage where they could produce glue-bound books and so on, and so that's what happened. And the first edition of Diggers and Dreamers came out at the end of 1989. We had this launch event. We thought the Green Party conference, that would be a good place to launch it. We didn't have any particular connection to the Green Party, but other than philosophically, of course. But
Mm.
we thought, yeah, that's a good place. And we ended up in Wolverhampton, which was where it was happening that year. And the sort of fair was on the sixth floor of a nearby tower block. Nobody ever went there. The whole conference is happening down in the town hall, down in the street below. And so that
All
was
right, so you weren't in the thick of the
nice.
conference. You were at on the sixth floor of some tower
Yeah,
block across the road. Oh
yeah.
God! And who was on the who was the original Diggers and Dreamers collective at that time?
Oh my goodness. Well, we had Pam Dorling, who not long after moved to from Lifespan, in fact, to North America and lives in Twin Oaks community and has
Oh
lived there ever
wow!
since.
Oh my
And
goodness!
that's a great inspiration to me that she's lived there so long. And Twin Oaks is the ultimate income sharing community in the USA, really.
Hmm.
A very organized sort of hammock making business and things like that. And then William Morris, who is still involved on the edge of Diggers and Dreamers.
Hmm.
Then there was Vera Ansell from Redfield, and Andy Wood, who was a member of Rainbow Housing Co-op in Milton Keynes at the time.
Did Andy Wood write books? Do I remember that? Maybe not.
No, don't think so.
Okay.
And then, of course, Chris Coates, who is still alongside me involved in Diggers and Dreamers.
Never heard of him. So that was 1989, and Diggers and Dreamers is still running pretty successfully, actually, I would suggest, but it's changed over time. So it's gone from a book-based directory that initially, am I right, was it produced yearly?
It was every 2 years.
Right.
We thought an annual thing was a bit too much, but we thought 2 yearly things, yeah, was probably the maximum we could before it went sort of hugely out of date. That was our theory at the time. So throughout the 1990s, we did it every 2 years.
And have you seen much change, sort of, I guess, 1970s right the way through to the present day? Would you say that the communities movement has changed? And if you have seen changes, what would you say were the significant changes over that period?
I think the fact that people from a sort of wider section of society are involved is the biggest one. Um, because if you look back to the 70s, yeah, there were those big house communes, and then there were a lot of urban squatting turned into housing co-ops. So, but it still very much involved the people who had been the squatters, if you see what I mean. Uh, whereas as time has gone on, obviously, new generations have come through. So those urban housing co-ops exist in a much bigger and organized form now, and they are not necessarily communal. they have aspects of communality in them, but people often have a self-contained flat in a housing co-op. And then, of course, that morphs really into the idea of co-housing, which, has become a huge thing in the period. And I think I'm right in saying we had an article about co-housing in the very first edition of Diggers and Dreamers, when at that time it didn't exist in this country at all, but had a big presence in Denmark, particularly. And for listeners who don't completely know what these definitions mean, I mean, the idea of co-housing basically is that every household is a self-contained unit, but there is usually some kind of common house and maybe other shared facilities. So that's obviously a format that is attractive to a much wider proportion of the population than people who want to be all living together, sharing absolutely everything, sharing all the decision making and so on.
So do you see, for example, you've talked about Lifespan. So Lifespan was an income sharing community, and they were not they weren't common, but they weren't unheard of sort of in the 1970s. And yet they seem to be becoming more rare. Do you think that the people of the 1970s would look forward to the 2020s and recognize the movement as it is now?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, it could be that people who were very much in that mindset of the only way, the pure one pure way is for us to income and life share all together. And so I think if they were to flash forward to the 2020s and look at the co-housing communities that exist in this country, then they might feel disappointed. But I think actually, if they'd lived through the intervening decades, they would see that it's a very, very positive part of the progress. There's nothing to stop people trying to income share as well as the other things within a co-housing community. It's up to them to decide to do it, but actually to have it like baked into the kind of philosophy of the place is probably a bit too much of an ask. And if you're in that little bubble where you're doing so much with everybody who's around you, I think it can become a bit too much, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I suspect, I've never been to Twin Oaks in the USA, but I suspect that Twin Oaks has survived so long doing it because it's a much, much larger place. Whereas Lifespan was and is a terrace of cottages high in the Yorkshire moors that's very often cut off in the middle of winter.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of
It's
Lifespan.
interesting that it carries on to this day, but it doesn't function in the way that it did in the 1970s because probably that was all a bit too much to expect of people.
I think it's interesting that you've talked about Twin Oaks, because I think you're right in a way that the size of Twin Oaks, and also they are even though the idea of income pooling is quite radical, they're also quite clear about what their goals. They're not fluffy about it. I from some reading I've done, I understand that when you enter Twin Oaks, your assets are either absorbed into the community or suspended, including bank accounts, and which puts everybody sort of on an even footing, and then everybody engages in income creation and income sharing in the community. And I do think you're right. I think there is a sort of an economics of size that perhaps would be much more difficult to achieve at a smaller scale, but still really interesting to have those models in existence because they kind of feed the imagination for what might be possible. Yeah. So in terms of your involvement with Diggers and Dreamers over time, we're now at a point where we also have a very popular website. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, we were quite, relatively early adopters, I guess. I think the website has existed since about the year 2000. Um, I think it's quite a lot better now than it has been in previous years. A bit slow for my liking, but we're working on that. But I think in terms of the information on there, it's really good. Um, and I think it does make make the whole set of ideas accessible to a much wider proportion of the population. And we try to be this sort of giant funnel in a way that if anybody's interested in communal living of any kind, then we want Diggers and Dreamers to be the first point that they come to. And it's not for our own self-aggrandizement we want to do that. It's because we feel that if people want, they might be interested in co-housing. They want their own front door. That's an idea they have in mind. But if they don't actually find that on their search for communal living, if they find just stuff about low impact communities where everybody lives in a bender, then they might say, no, I'm not going to do that. Whereas if we have Diggers and Dreamers as this sort of giant funnel head, and there are people who want to live in benders, and it will lead them in the direction of low impact off grid communities where people do that. People want to live in a place where they've got their own front door and their own self contained house, then they'll be guided towards co housing and other permutations of those things. And so there's a lot more that these places have in common than they think. And I think that's something we want to get across to people, that in the past, people might have thought, oh, yeah, there's only this one way of doing it. But actually, there's multiple ways of doing it, as long as you're not too restrictive on your definitions of things. I don't know whether anybody's decoded what's on the cover of the most recent edition of Diggers and Dreamers, but I can explain it if you think that's...
We're talking about the minty green cover.
Yeah, but more importantly, there's a kind of stylized image of a new build co-housing community and a stylized image of an off-grid community. And overlaid over that is a little diagram. And what they have in common is that their little living units are in yellow. And so in the off-grid community, there's little yellow blobs around the place, whereas in the new build co-housing community, there's a street of rectilinear houses. But in both cases, there's some kind of common facility. There's a common house in the co-housing facility. There's probably a common teepee or something for the off-grid community. And so it's where people kind of get together.
I know, as someone who came to Diggers and Dreamers via the website, it did feel like a window into a secret world, or at least that was my experience. That you kind of opened this little window and it was like suddenly it was all these communities that were happening they weren't off the radar, but it felt like they were off the radar. It felt like it was a little curtain and you could look in, and the excitement of those communities that actually had the button on it that said, yes, we do welcome people as visitors, was equally as thrilling, because it was like, oh my gosh, I could go and have a look. I can see, dip my toe into something that maybe is a little bit scary from the outside. No, it's a wonderful thing, wonderful experience. So I was wondering, with the creation or the development of the website, how did you decide to format the website to give people the kind of the insight into the different types of communities?
Um, we Once the web came along, we thought probably there's going to be no need to do our printed books anymore. And we really based the website around the directory more than anything else, because obviously it could potentially be bang up to date the entire time. So that was that formatting. But the after a few years, we realized there was still a demand for the book, and people like to have printed versions. And so we now produce the book every 5 years rather than every 2 years. But we've stuck to the original format that we've had going right back to that first edition in 1989, of it being half articles and half directory. And we don't currently particularly have articles on the website. We could in the future, but we just haven't done that so far. But we felt that the format of the main book, the main Diggers and Dreamers book, with half articles and half directory, is something that is very appealing to people, because there's an opportunity in the articles to give both overviews and also descriptions of day-by-day experiences to people, and then for people to flick through the directory and see, yes, they do this here, they do that there. This place they pray every day. This place they grow vegetables every day.
I think it's a great format, actually, because it's a real insight into communal living that you wouldn't get solely through through a directory gives you, where is it, what does it do, what kind of community are they, what things might you expect to find here. Whereas the articles themselves are much more like a sort of a deep dig. It quite often they're accounts written by people who are either living in communities now or have lived in community, or possibly, for example, in my own case, who research communities, which means that you get that kind of additional layer of experience. And in fact, because I have got quite a lot of the copies of the directories, they don't age in a way that you would expect them to age, because people are quite often talking about the experience itself as opposed to what's happening in 1990. So it means you can go back to those different directories and you can read about, for example, the experience of setting up. I remember, I think there was one about the experience of setting up a place to celebrate or to bury the people who had died in community, and that becomes ageless because it's an experience that someone could go back and dip into. So even as a collective, those books seem to sort of fit together really nicely and to create a history of communal living. Was that in your mind at the time, or is that something that's just been sort of lucky?
Yeah, I think it's been a lucky thing, but I think something I've uh, been aware of in the course of those intervening decades is just how important it is to kind of have this history written down. And that's, my colleague Chris obviously has written two stupendous books, Utopia Britannica and Communes Britannica. And I'm so glad really that he did that. And I think it's triggered other people with memories, their own personal memories of living in more specific communities, to write them down as well. And, we've, as Diggers and Dreamers publications, we've moved into sort of publishing some of those books. And the reason I think it's important is that there is a kind of tendency for people to feel, as you describe it, they stumble upon the website or wherever, there's this whole other world in there, and they think often themselves, oh goodness, this is all happening for the first time.
Yeah.
I've never heard of this before, and now it is. And they start becoming part of it. No, but they think they're inventing everything themselves from scratch. Whereas in fact, people have been doing this again and again and again and again for decades. And there is so much to learn from people's previous experiences of doing things collectively. And um, unless those things are available in some kind of written form, then um, then that information never gets passed on. And then there are ever new generations who think it's something new. And then, of course, there are doubters who say, oh, well, it's newfangled stuff. That'll never happen. That'll never work. And, that's where you have to contrast the alternative society, if you dare call it that anymore, with the mainstream society, which has this huge kind of amount of history to it that is forever repeating to give itself credibility. And, people, the most dreadful of politicians all go to public schools and they're all alumni of these schools and so on. Why can't we have people who are alumni of communities who are kind of giving credibility to those things that have existed for decades and decades?
Yeah. Yeah.
If we emphasize that more, and it's not about nostalgia, it's not about looking back to the past and just reliving it and today's not as good as it was. It's just about recognizing that these things happened and there are things to be learned, and a lot of things actually do work. And let's carry on doing
Absolutely.
more, developing them into the future.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you, Jonathan. I was just thinking about that in the context of, is this like a sort of foundation stone or a historical roots that stretch back a long way, and how you envisage, like, what would you say was the the guiding principles or the role of diggers and dreamers today?
Whoa.
You've got to be very careful here.
Yeah. Well, I think my own view is that communal living or it's cooperation really. I'm not obsessed with communal living. I don't think that's the all important thing for that everybody should be doing it. But I think sharing, cooperation, and collectivity is very important, and that's what's really, really needed in the sort of wider society. And a lot of communities get set up as kind of educational sort of places, or else to be models of how things could operate. And I think that actually is very much to be promoted, because I think it's so important that people kind of do things together, share things together, and show that it can be done. And it's the sort of thing that I think in the coming decades, as energy becomes more and more ridiculously expensive, probably people are going to have to share more, and there are a lot of lessons that have been learnt in communal living situations that can be transferred to the wider society. And I've been on the local council for the last 7 years down here, and where I live, and I often say to people, I talk to them about my own experiences of communal living and say, I know that these things can work because of that experience. I know that you could have a street that had a carpool of 2 or 3 cars. It doesn't have to have a car in every household drive. People could be sharing power tools. They could be doing all sorts of things. They don't have to live in a commune to do it. And I'm not as thinking that they have to at all. But I think the intentional communities of today are really good models and examples of that. If their awareness of them can be brought to a wider audience, then they can have a much bigger impact than they do. I mean, I'm often quoting this thing. I heard it at Findhorn, kind of about 35 years ago, I think, about what happens when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, and I was amazed to hear it, but I mean, I gather it's true. You know, the caterpillar's crawling around with umpteen legs on it and eating lettuce leaves and all the rest, and just being a caterpillar. But apparently, in the caterpillar, there are these cells that are called imaginal cells, and some of them are thinking, "I want to fly, I want to fly," and the rest of the caterpillar's cells are saying, "No, you can't fly. You're part of a caterpillar. Which we just crawl around on the ground." But then at a certain point, what happens is the caterpillar, spins a web around it, hangs itself on a branch, whatever, and inside that chrysalis that it's created, the whole cell structure of the caterpillar dissolves and turns into this kind of soup. And at that point, the imaginal cells start to become the really important bits, and then the parts of the soup coalesce around them, and then eventually, of course, the chrysalis breaks open and the butterfly flies out. And I think it's a really beautiful sort of metaphor for how things could develop. That when you're in your sort of darkest hour, thinking, "Oh God, the world is going to hell in a handcart," maybe it's just entering the soup stage.
Oh my gosh, I do. I love it. Imaginal cells and humanity entering its soup stage. But I do see all of those things. I think I was just noting down here. So we're seeing an emergence, or at least maybe even a resurgence of some of the ideals that I would say were either born or incubated in different types of intentional communities. So things like the library of things, where people can go borrow large tools that they possibly wouldn't want to or couldn't afford to own separately. I can't remember, in Wales, I think it's called Pentheneg or something, but I've seen it. It's there, and growing. Cooperative buying. I know that some communities have their own little shop where they buy everything in bulk, and then people can buy it at cost. It's a non-profit making collective shop, which I think is fantastic. And like you said, the carpooling, which some communities do extremely successfully, which enables them to completely cut down on the number of vehicles that they own as a group. And like you say, that could so easily be a street or a terrace of houses that could go into that model. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think there's some really interesting crossovers that can come out of the communal movement into mainstream and be very successful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that essentially the kind of energy and material wealth that we have in our kind of civilizations have had for the last couple of 100 years, it enables people to sort of buy themselves out of sharing, and then it's viewed as the norm. I mean, you watch those sort of TV property programs, and Phil and Kirsty are telling people, they often, I've noticed how they very often refer to, you're not students anymore. You're living in a grown-up house, and you're going to be grown-up people with a proper fitted kitchen and a proper fitted bathroom and a bedroom that's a sanctuary and all that sort of stuff.
And three other bedrooms that will remain empty for
Yes,
90%
that's
of the
right.
year.
And I think, well, I mean, I'm 70 years old. Wouldn't think twice about living like a student in many ways.
Mm,
It doesn't feel like a big deal to me.
mm.
I don't see it as growing up. It's like it's yeah, a horrible kind of thing, really.
It is fascinating. I live in a terrace, so traditional Welsh terrace house in a very normal mainstream Welsh town. And when we went into lockdown, we spent a lot of time in our gardens, myself and all of my neighbours, and started doing that thing where we talked across the fences and the hedges and things. And it was fast. We had a discussion at one point about, wow, if we took down all of these fences, we would, we could really do something with these relatively small gardens, but we could have a little tiny pocket woodland, and a shared kind of shed that we could also turn into sort of something a bit bigger. And we had all these conversations, which I found absolutely fascinating. And then lockdown finished, and we all went back to work, and it didn't happen. But it was a wonderful moment to have those discussions about how much we could collectively achieve that we couldn't achieve as individuals. Yeah, really interesting. So we're edging our way towards the end of this. I've got a question that I wanted to ask you about trends in communal living. So as the person who oversees the Diggers and Dreamers website, have you seen any changes or trends emerge over the last 30 to 40 years?
I think the major change has really been in the last 10 or 15 years, and that has been towards new build co-housing communities, which is something that I think was kind of unimaginable back in the 1980s and 90s. But it's very inspiring to see that happening. And I think what is really interesting about that also is that in doing something as a new build, you actually have to think about how the community is going to operate once it's up and running. If you're retrofitting an old building or something like that, you sort of are stuck with various aspects to it. If it's a big country house, it's these huge bloody great rooms on the ground floor with double height ceilings,
Mm.
things like that. Um, and you just have to live with them and work around them, and you do your best. But actually, with a co-housing scheme that's going to be built from scratch, you've got to work with the designers and decide how you want it to be. And in the practical guide to co-housing that we've recently jointly published with the UK Co-housing Network, there's quite a chunk in there about the layout of a co-housing scheme, and where you place a common house in a co-housing scheme, because you want to have it in a position where the maximum number of people are going to be passing it all the time. You don't want it in a dark sort of corner that nobody goes unless they're actually going there specially. And so I'm very heartened by that trend of not only seeing those kind of developments happen, but also people thinking about how the place is going to operate as well, and whether consensus decision making is going to be the best way, or consensus minus one, or sociocracy, or whatever. Actually standing back and looking at it and thinking, well, what is the most viable way for us to make decisions that where we can all happily live alongside each other and not have feuds and that sort of thing? Because I think that's one of the problems with communal living all along, has been people arriving at different stages of their own sort of personal development, and obviously with their own backgrounds and histories and that kind of thing. And some people very, very sussed a lot of emotional intelligence, and realizing you can't just like shout over people at meetings and that sort of thing. And other people not having had that experience and just being like thrown into it and often becoming quite problematic as members of groups. And it's back again to the whole thing about the hippies had the right idea but not organized. And I think more and more that I think it's summed up in our name of our book and website and so on, Diggers and Dreamers. And I think when we invented the name, it came up in a drunken evening in a pub in North Bucks. At the time, people said, yeah, that's just right. All communities have diggers and dreamers in them. They're two types of people. And I think at the time we said, yeah, I don't think we ever wrote this down, but we said to ourselves or to each other that, yeah, a successful community is one where you've got an equal number of diggers and an equal number of dreamers. And I think my ideas have shifted over the years about that. I now think that you need to aspire to make every member 50% dreamer, 50% digger. Because actually, if you have 50% dreamers and 50% diggers in your community, then you're likely to end up with a sort of feud between the two, and basically there'll be a bust up and people leave. But
the diggers will accumulate resentment towards the dreamers for their dreaminess,
indeed. But
and
the
vice
role
versa.
of the dreamer is important.
Yes.
Because it ties in with that. It's the bird's eye view, basically. It's like the dreamer has the bird's eye view of the project. The digger has the worm's eye view. And you need both those things. And a lot of communities are set up by dreamers who are then like frustrated by how they operate in the first, and then they leave after 5 years because it's just full of people who don't have a vision.
People who want rules.
Yeah, who want rules. But and to me, yeah, where I say the hippies were right, yeah, hippies were right at the dreaming end, but they couldn't do the digging end really. They weren't that organized. I mean, this is a huge generalization, isn't it? But you know what I mean.
I think, yeah, absolutely. And I can see the links here between, as an academic, I guess I would see the links between that and a lot of the utopian literature, this idea about being able to vision a future, kind of thinking beyond the parameters of the immediate society that we live in. And I think you're spot on, really. Without that vision, then what we do is we repeat what we know, as opposed to reaching beyond what we know. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to think about. So, having made this journey, Jonathan, across the decades with Diggers and Dreamers, what would you say were your kind of key takeaways or your things that you've learned during your time doing this?
I think it's that for us as a sort of civilization to carry on, then we need to expect to have a lot more drama in our lives. And that sounds it sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But in terms of, I think the thing that would put a lot of people off communal living is they say, oh, I wouldn't want all those meetings. I don't want to have to discuss everything. And I think that's understandable that people say that. But the way that our kind of civilization is, or society, our particular society is structured at the moment, is that actually people just aren't involved in decision making at all. They resent it. They resent that other people are making decisions on their behalf. But at the same time, they don't particularly want to kind of be doing it themselves. And I think people are going to have to bite the bullet and accept this is how it's going to be. And if you are going to share more things with your neighbors, say you've got a common shed or something with a lot of power tools in that you share between you, well, you've got to have a few meetings now and again and discuss how you're going to organize it and not be get angry with people and stuff like that. You've got to learn all those things. And I think, to me, that's what has been the best thing about communal and cooperative living that I've experienced. That these things are possible, and people just need to get on with it, really. And here's a bunch of people who are doing it already and have been doing it for decades. And it's perfectly viable, and in the long run, it'll be more viable, actually. Be more viable than the civilization where you buy and you pay somebody else to do everything for you.
That's yeah. I could completely see that we have become very good at just buying in solutions, and I think you're right. We can learn an awful lot about collectivity without actually having to live in a community. We can take loads of the learning from that. Okay, thank you. That's been really interesting, Jonathan. It's been a great session, and I look forward to our next meeting.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communard's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.